In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the ideological roots of fascism began to take shape as a reaction to a range of social, political, and cultural developments. It arose in a period marked by rapid industrialization, mass urbanization, and the dislocation of traditional social structures. Many Europeans were disillusioned with the liberal democratic order and skeptical of the promises of socialism. This environment created fertile ground for new ideologies that emphasized order, unity, and strength. Fascism absorbed and transformed various intellectual influences. One of its core inspirations was nationalism, which was growing in intensity during this period. National identity was increasingly seen as under threat from cosmopolitan liberalism and socialist internationalism. Fascist ideologues believed that only a strong, centralized nation-state could preserve the purity and strength of the nation. Philosophically, fascism drew from thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche, whose critique of modern decadence and call for the emergence of a heroic Superman resonated with early fascist leaders. Georges Sorel's ideas about the power of myth and violence to inspire collective action were also influential. He advocated for the use of powerful, emotionally charged narratives, such as the myth of a general strike or national rebirth, as a means of mobilizing masses, a strategy fascists would later adopt. Another major influence came from the decline of faith in liberal democracy. By the early 20th century, many critics viewed parliamentary systems as weak, indecisive, and incapable of dealing with the crises of the age, especially during and after World War I. Fascism emerged as a proposed alternative that rejected both the perceived softness of liberal democracy and the class conflict promoted by Marxism. It positioned itself as a third way, favoring neither capitalism nor communism, but a new system focused on national unity and hierarchical order. Anti-rationalism and anti-Enlightenment sentiment also played a part. Fascism often dismissed reason and individualism, instead glorifying instinct, emotion, and the collective will. This was accompanied by a romantic idealization of the past, especially the medieval and imperial eras, which were seen as times of national strength, honor, and discipline. Overall, fascism in this early phase was not yet a fixed ideology, but rather a growing cluster of ideas. Emotional, anti-modern, authoritarian, nationalistic, and anti-Marxist, that would later be systematized and weaponized by leaders like Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler. The rise of fascism in Italy between 1919 and 1922 took place in the chaotic aftermath of World War I, during a time of deep national crisis. Italy had emerged from the war technically on the winning side, but the country felt betrayed by the post-war treaties, particularly the Treaty of Versailles, which failed to grant Italy all the territorial gains it had been promised. This perceived betrayal was known as the mutilated victory, Vittoria Mutilata, and led to widespread resentment and disillusionment. Italy was also suffering from severe economic instability. Inflation was rampant, unemployment was high, and returning soldiers found little support or opportunity. The years 1919 to 1920, known as the Biennio Rosso, 2 red years, saw a wave of strikes, factory occupations, and land seizures inspired by socialist and anarchist movements. The liberal government, already weakened, seemed incapable of controlling the situation. This environment of fear and instability led many among the middle and upper classes to seek a forceful alternative that could restore order and suppress leftist agitation. It was in this volatile climate that Benito Mussolini, a former socialist, who had broken with the movement over his support for Italy's participation in World War I, founded the Fasci Italiani di Combattimento in March 1919. This organization combined nationalism, anti-communism, and paramilitary violence. Mussolini attracted war veterans, disaffected youth, and middle-class conservatives who feared a socialist revolution. The movement's black-shirted squads, known as the Squadristi, engaged in violent attacks against trade unions, socialist offices, and leftist leaders, often with the tacit approval of the police and local elites. In the 1921 elections, Mussolini's movement, rebranded as the National Fascist Party, Partito Nazionale Fascista, entered parliament gaining legitimacy within the political system. However, the fascists continued to use violence and intimidation to consolidate their power. By 1922, Italy was gripped by fear of total collapse. The liberal government of Prime Minister Luigi Facta was paralyzed, unable to maintain order or contain the fascist militias. In October 1922, Mussolini and the fascist leadership organized the March on Rome, a calculated show of force involving thousands of fascist supporters converging on the capital. Though the actual military threat was limited, the psychological impact was enormous. King Victor Emmanuel III, fearing civil war and doubting the government's ability to handle the situation, refused to declare martial law and instead invited Mussolini to form a new government. On October 31, 1922, Mussolini became the youngest prime minister in Italian history, marking the beginning of fascist rule in Italy. His rise was not a sudden revolution, but a gradual takeover, exploiting the weaknesses of the liberal state, the fears of the ruling classes, and the widespread desire for order and national revival. Following Mussolini's rise to power in Italy, fascism began to spread and adapt across Europe during the 1920s and 1930s. The ideology appealed to many in countries facing political instability, economic crises, and fear of communism. While each adaptation had unique national characteristics, they shared common elements such as authoritarianism, extreme nationalism, a rejection of liberal democracy, and a glorification of violence and the state. In Germany, fascism took root in the form of National Socialism, or Nazism, under the leadership of Adolf Hitler. After the economic devastation of the Great Depression and the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, many Germans were drawn to the Nazi Party's promises of national renewal, economic revival, and strong leadership. Hitler's movement differed from Italian fascism in its obsession with racial purity, anti-Semitism, and the idea of Aryan supremacy. While Mussolini emphasized state power and unity, Hitler fused fascist principles with a pseudo-scientific racial ideology, portraying Jews, Roma, and other minorities as existential threats to the German nation. The Nazi Party seized power in 1933, transforming Germany into a totalitarian state. Fascist-inspired movements also emerged in other parts of Europe. In Spain, General Francisco Franco led a nationalist uprising against the Democratic Second Republic in 1936, initiating a brutal civil war. With support from Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, Franco ultimately triumphed in 1939 and established a long-lasting authoritarian regime, though it was more conservative and militarist than ideologically fascist in the strict sense. In Hungary, Admiral Miklos Horthy oversaw a right-wing authoritarian regime that sympathized with fascism and later aligned with Nazi Germany. In Romania, the Iron Guard combined fascist ideology with Orthodox Christian mysticism and intense anti-Semitism taught elsewhere. Fascist movements gained traction but did not always succeed in seizing power. In Britain, Oswald Mosley founded the British Union of Fascists, advocating for corporatism and strong leadership, though he never achieved mass support. In France, groups like the Croix de Feu and later the Parti Populaire Français echoed fascist themes but remained on the political fringes. In countries such as Portugal, Poland, and Austria, authoritarian governments adopted some fascist-style features, such as censorship, nationalism, and one-party rule, without fully embracing the fascist ideology or movement. By the late 1930s, fascism had evolved into a transnational phenomenon, adapting itself to local conditions while maintaining its core principles of hierarchy, obedience, militarism, and the rejection of democratic pluralism. The growing influence of fascism contributed to the polarization of international politics and paved the way for the outbreak of World War II, as fascist regimes became increasingly aggressive in pursuing territorial expansion and nationalistic ambitions. Fascism, as an ideology, is defined by a distinct set of core principles that collectively reject liberal democracy, individualism, and class-based politics in favor of an all-encompassing, authoritarian national state. At its heart, fascism glorifies the nation as an organic, living entity that must be protected, purified, and empowered at all costs. The individual is seen not as a bearer of rights, but as a servant of the nation, whose purpose is to contribute to national strength and unity. One of the defining features of fascism is the belief in a strong, centralized authority led by a charismatic leader. This leader is often portrayed as the embodiment of the national will and is granted unchecked power to make decisions without consultation or opposition. Fascism promotes the idea that only through absolute loyalty to this leader and the state can the nation be revived and made great. Fascism is fundamentally anti-democratic. It sees parliamentary systems, pluralism, and political debate as signs of weakness and decay. Elections and representative institutions are usually either abolished or rendered meaningless. Fascists argue that unity and decisiveness can only be achieved through the elimination of political opposition and the concentration of power in a single party or leader. This often goes hand in hand with the violent suppression of dissent, censorship of the press, and the use of secret police to monitor and silence critics. Militarism and the cult of violence are central to fascist ideology. War is not seen as a tragedy, but as a noble and necessary act for national regeneration. Fascists believe that struggle and conflict are natural states of human existence and that peace leads to decadence and weakness. Violence is therefore not only accepted but celebrated as a means of forging unity and demonstrating strength. Fascism also promotes a corporatist economic model in which class conflict is suppressed in favor of cooperation between workers, employers, and the state. Unlike Marxism, which emphasizes class struggle, fascism seeks to maintain the existing social hierarchy while integrating all economic activity into a state-controlled framework. Trade unions are typically dismantled or brought under state control, and private enterprise is allowed as long as it serves national interests. Another crucial element is the use of propaganda and myth. Fascist regimes rely heavily on mass media, spectacle, and symbolic imagery to instill loyalty and inspire emotional commitment to the state. They often construct a narrative of national humiliation, followed by promised renewal, portraying themselves as saviors, leading a return to past greatness. This myth-making is used to galvanize the population and justify radical changes in governance and society. Finally, fascism frequently involves the identification and demonization of internal and external enemies. These can include ethnic minorities, political dissidents, foreigners, or other marginalized groups, who are portrayed as threats to national unity and purity. In the case of Nazism, this aspect became central, with racial ideology and anti-Semitism becoming core components of state policy. In all its forms, fascism uses fear, exclusion, and hatred as tools to consolidate power and maintain control over society. The outbreak of World War II in 1939 marked the beginning of the most aggressive phase of fascist expansion, led by the regimes of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. Both states, driven by nationalist ambition and a belief in military conquest as a path to greatness, pursued expansionist policies that destabilized Europe. Germany, under Adolf Hitler, invaded Poland in September 1939, prompting Britain and France to declare war. This marked the official start of the conflict. Hitler's vision of Lebensraum, or living space, for the German people, fueled further invasions across Europe, including France, the Low Countries, and eventually the Soviet Union. Italy, under Benito Mussolini, entered the war in 1940, hoping to build a new Roman Empire in the Mediterranean and North Africa. However, Italy's military was poorly prepared, and its campaigns met with repeated failures. Both Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy relied on brutal methods of occupation, including mass executions, forced labor, and widespread repression of resistance movements. The ideological nature of the conflict was especially apparent in the Holocaust, where Nazi racial ideology culminated in the systematic extermination of 6 million Jews and millions of other perceived enemies, including Roma, Slavs, disabled individuals, and political dissidents. As the war progressed, the tide began to turn against the Axis powers. The entry of the Soviet Union and the United States into the war brought overwhelming military and industrial strength to the Allied side. Germany suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Stalingrad in 1943, marking a major turning point. Italy experienced a full collapse of its fascist regime that same year. Mussolini was deposed by his own Grand Council and arrested, although he was later rescued by German forces and installed as the puppet leader of the so-called Italian Social Republic in northern Italy. His power, however, was limited and short-lived. By 1945, Allied forces were closing in on Berlin from the west and the east. Hitler committed suicide in his bunker in April 1945 as Soviet troops entered the city. Mussolini, attempting to flee to Switzerland, was captured and executed by Italian partisans. Their deaths symbolized the definitive collapse of fascist rule in Europe. In the aftermath of the war, the full horrors of fascist regimes were exposed through documentation, survivor testimony, and the Nuremberg trials, where leading Nazis were prosecuted for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against peace. The defeat of the Axis powers in World War II led to the near-total discrediting of fascism as a legitimate political ideology. Its association with genocide, militarism, and authoritarian brutality left it morally and politically bankrupt in the eyes of most of the world. Although echoes of fascist ideology would reappear in various forms in later decades, the end of the war marked the end of fascism as a major governing force in global politics. In the aftermath of World War II, fascism was widely condemned and discredited due to its association with genocide, totalitarianism, and aggressive militarism. The fall of Nazi Germany and fascist Italy left a deep scar on the global conscience, and efforts were made to prevent the re-emergence of such ideologies. The Allied powers initiated denazification programs in Germany, dismantled fascist institutions, and prosecuted key leaders in the Nuremberg trials, which set a precedent for international justice and the concept of crimes against humanity. Despite its collapse as a governing ideology, fascism did not disappear entirely. In several countries, former fascists and sympathizers rebranded themselves and continued to operate on the political fringes. In Italy, the Movimento Sociale Italiano, Italian social movement, was founded in 1946 by former fascists and aimed to preserve elements of Mussolini's legacy, though it eventually moderated its stance over the decades. In Germany, overtly, fascist parties were banned, but neo-Nazi groups continued to emerge in underground circles, often centered on nationalist and racist ideologies. Fascism's legacy also lingered in the form of authoritarian regimes that adopted some of its techniques and rhetoric, even if they did not fully embrace fascist ideology. In Spain, Francisco Franco remained in power until his death in 1975, leading a nationalist dictatorship that retained fascist aesthetics and suppressed dissent. Similar regimes emerged in Latin America, where military juntas in countries like Argentina and Chile used anti-communist rhetoric, state terror, and centralized authority reminiscent of fascist rule. In the intellectual realm, scholars debated the nature and definition of fascism, leading to a wide range of interpretations. Some viewed it as a uniquely European, early 20th century phenomenon tied to the conditions of interwar crisis, while others identified fascism as a recurring political impulse rooted in ultranationalism, authoritarianism, and the rejection of illiberal values. The term fascist also began to be used more loosely as a political insult, which sometimes diluted its meaning and historical specificity. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the resurgence of far-right populism, nationalism, and xenophobia in various countries led to renewed comparisons with fascism. While most contemporary movements differ in context and structure from historical fascism, they often draw on similar themes, such as the glorification of a strong leader, hostility toward immigrants, disdain for democratic institutions, and the promotion of a homogeneous national identity. These parallels have sparked debates about whether elements of fascism are re-emerging in modern political life under new guises. The legacy of fascism remains a warning about the dangers of authoritarianism, demagoguery, and mass manipulation. Its history has become a central case study in how democratic institutions can be undermined, how fear can be weaponized, and how ideologies promising national strength can ultimately lead to destruction and moral catastrophe.